The storm clouds had gathered with unusual fury over Cottonwood Creek that April evening in 1875. But Beatrice King had been too consumed with grief to notice the darkening sky until the first raindrops hammered against her window like angry fists. 6 months, a widow at 23, she'd finally managed to establish herself on the small homestead she and Thomas had claimed before consumption took him, leaving her alone on the edge of the Wyoming Territory with nothing but dreams and debts. The wind howled through the cottonwoods surrounding her modest cabin, a sound Beatrice had grown accustomed to during her 3 years on the frontier. But tonight something in its pitch sent a chill down her spine. She moved quickly to secure the shutters, fighting against the growing gale as the skies opened up and unleashed a torrent unlike anything she'd experienced since moving west from Boston. "Just hold together," she whispered to the sturdy walls Thomas had built, running her hand along the rough-hewn timber as the cabin groaned against the assault. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the single room in harsh white light before plunging it back into darkness. In that brief flash, Beatrice caught sight of the leak forming in the corner of the ceiling, water already beginning to pool on the plank floor below. The roar that followed wasn't thunder. It was something far more terrifying, the sound of timber splitting and nails screaming as they tore free from their moorings. Before Beatrice could react, the entire western section of her roof ripped away, exposing her home to the full fury of the storm. She screamed, the sound lost in the howling wind as rain poured into her home, drenching everything she owned. Beatrice scrambled to salvage what she could: the quilt her mother had made, Thomas's letters, the small wooden box containing their marriage certificate and the deed to their land. She worked frantically, dragging her precious belongings to the eastern corner of the cabin, where a portion of the roof still offered some protection. For hours, she huddled beneath her kitchen table, wrapped in the soaked quilt as the storm raged around her, destroying the home she had fought so hard to keep. When dawn finally broke, Beatrice emerged to survey the damage, her heart sinking at the sight. Nearly half her roof was gone, sections of wall had collapsed, and everything she owned was soaked through. The small garden she had planted just days earlier had been washed away completely, taking with it her hopes for a sustainable summer. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, pushing her sodden hair from her face as she took stock of her situation. The nearest town, Willow Creek, was 15 miles away, and her horse had broken free during the night, likely spooked by the storm. She had little money, fewer resources, and winter stores that were now mostly ruined. Beatrice allowed herself precisely 5 minutes to cry before squaring her shoulders and getting to work. Thomas hadn't married a quitter. He'd married a Boston schoolteacher who traded her comfortable life for adventure and love in the West, and she wouldn't dishonor his memory by giving up now. She began the painstaking process of laying out everything to dry in the morning sun, grateful at least that the storm had passed and left clear skies in its wake. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. Startled, she grabbed the rifle she kept by the door, another skill Thomas had insisted she learn, and turned toward the sound. A tall man astride a chestnut gelding came into view, his broad-shouldered silhouette rimmed by the morning sun. He pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance from what remained of her cabin and raised his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Madam," he called out, his voice deep but gentle, "looks like that storm did you no favors." Beatrice kept the rifle steady, though not aimed directly at him. "State your business, sir." He dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. Now that he was closer, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps late 20s or early 30s. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were clear and direct, the color of the summer sky. "Name's Preston Miller," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with a slight wave to it. "I was riding fence for the Double R when the storm hit. Took shelter in an old line shack about 2 miles east, saw your roof from the ridge this morning." Beatrice lowered her rifle slightly but remained wary. Life in the territory had taught her caution around strangers, especially men who appeared unannounced. "Beatrice King," she replied. "My husband Thomas and I settled this land 3 years ago. He's been gone since November." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. He nodded once, respectfully, then gestured toward the cabin. "That roof won't fix itself, Mrs. King, and another storm's likely coming by week's end. I've got a hammer, saw, and strong back if you'd accept the help." "And what would you want in return?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I don't have much to offer." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "A meal wouldn't go amiss if you can manage it. Otherwise, consider it neighborly duty." Beatrice considered him for a long moment. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner direct but not threatening. Something about the way he stood patient, waiting for her decision without pressing, eased her concerns. "I can manage a meal," she finally said, setting the rifle aside. "Though my stores took a beating in the storm." Preston nodded, returning his hat to his head. "I've got some jerky and coffee in my saddlebags. We can make do." And so began 3 days that would change Beatrice King's life forever, though she couldn't have known it then. Preston Miller worked from sunrise to sunset, first salvaging what he could of her original roof, before riding to town for additional supplies, paying from his own pocket despite Beatrice's protests. He slept in her barn, what remained of it, and respected the boundaries of propriety with a gentleman's care that surprised her. On the evening of the second day, as they sat on her newly repaired porch eating a simple stew Beatrice had prepared from their combined provisions, Preston spoke of his own journey west. "Left Philadelphia 6 years ago," he explained, his deep voice gentle in the gathering dusk. "My father was a carpenter, taught me the trade, but I wanted more sky than the city offered." Beatrice nodded, understanding completely. "Boston felt like that to me, all those buildings pressing in, everyone watching, judging. When Thomas proposed and said he wanted to seek our fortune in the West, I didn't hesitate." "Bold move for a city girl," Preston observed, though there was no mockery in his tone. "I was a schoolteacher," Beatrice admitted. "Everyone thought I'd lost my mind trading books and civilization for." She gestured around them at the wilderness stretching in every direction. "This. Do you regret it?" Preston asked, his blue eyes steady on hers. Beatrice considered the question, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above them. "Not even on days like yesterday," she said finally. "Thomas gave me freedom I never knew existed. Even now that he's gone, I feel more myself here than I ever did in Boston." Preston nodded, understanding written in the lines of his face. "The West has a way of stripping a person down to what matters. No room for pretense when you're fighting the land every day." "Is that why you stay?" Beatrice asked. "For the fight?" A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his weathered features. "I stay for the peace. City's got too many voices. Out here, a man can hear his own thoughts." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, watching night claim the land around them. Beatrice was struck by how natural it felt to sit beside this stranger who'd appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. By the third day, the roof was fully repaired, stronger than before. Preston had reinforced the walls that had been damaged and even fixed the leak in her water barrel that had plagued her all spring. "Should hold through the next storm and the one after that," he said, packing his tools as the afternoon sun began its descent. Beatrice felt a strange pang at the thought of his departure. 3 days wasn't long by any measure, but his steady presence had been a balm to her lonely soul. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Miller," she said formally, trying to mask her emotions. "What you've done, Preston," he interrupted gently. "And there's no need for thanks, Mrs. King." "Beatrice," she corrected, offering a small smile. He nodded, returning the smile. "Beatrice, then." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with words neither seemed ready to speak. Finally, Preston mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with the ease of a man born to it. "The double Arcticus about 10 miles northwest of here," he said, adjusting his hat against the sun. "If you need anything." "I'll manage," Beatrice assured him, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Preston studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "I expect you will. You strike me as a woman who knows her own mind." With a tip of his hat, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving Beatrice standing before her mended home, feeling strangely bereft despite having everything she needed to continue her solitary life. Or so she thought. 3 days later, a knock at her door revealed Preston Miller once again, this time with a young bay mare on a lead rope behind him. "Found her grazing near the creek," he explained as Beatrice stared in astonishment. "Figured she might be yours given the brand." It was indeed her horse, Penny, who had bolted during the storm. Beatrice had given up hope of finding the animal, resigned to the hardship of managing without her. "How did you?" she began, then stopped, overcome with gratitude. Preston shrugged, handing over the reins. "Just keeping an eye out." Double R hands ride this whole section, wasn't much trouble, but Beatrice knew better. The effort required to track, capture, and return her horse was considerable, especially for a man who owed her nothing. "Would you stay for supper?" she asked impulsively. "It's the least I can offer." Something warmed in Preston's eyes. "I'd be honored." That meal became the first of many over the following weeks. Preston would appear every few days, always with some practical reason, bringing her a repaired harness, helping to rebuild her chicken coop, delivering supplies from town that she might need. Each time, Beatrice invited him to stay for a meal, and gradually their conversations deepened beyond the practicalities of frontier survival. She learned he was 31, had never married, and had worked for nearly every ranch between Cheyenne and the Montana border before settling at the Double R 5 years earlier. He discovered she was 23, had married Thomas King at 19, and had taught herself to hunt after her husband's death because hunger was a more immediate concern than propriety. "Never met a lady who could field dress a deer before," Preston remarked one evening as they shared venison she had provided. "I'm not much of a lady anymore," Beatrice admitted, gesturing to her practical clothing and work-roughened hands. "Boston society would be scandalized." Preston studied her across the table, his gaze steady and warm. "Begging your pardon, but Boston society doesn't know a damn thing about what makes a lady." The compliment for it was clearly meant as such, brought color to Beatrice's cheeks. She found herself increasingly aware of Preston's presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the gentle strength in his hands, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It troubled her, this growing awareness. Thomas had been gone less than a year, and she had believed her heart buried with him. Late May brought another storm, less violent than the first but persistent in its soaking rain. Preston arrived at the height of it, drenched to the skin but smiling as Beatrice ushered him inside. "Roof's holding," he observed, removing his dripping hat. "Thanks to your craftsmanship," Beatrice acknowledged, handing him a towel. "Though I admit I held my breath during that first thunderclap." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a recognition of how far they had come since that first morning when she'd greeted him with a rifle. Beatrice turned away first, busying herself with preparing coffee to hide her confusion. "I've been offered a job," Preston said suddenly. "Foreman position on a ranch near Laramie." Beatrice's hands stilled on the coffee pot. "That's quite an opportunity." "It is," he agreed. "Better pay, more responsibility." "When would you leave?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "That's the thing," Preston said, his deep voice gentle. "I told them no." Beatrice turned to face him, surprise evident in her expression. "Why would you do that?" "The Double R can't match that kind of offer." Preston set his towel aside and took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "It's not about the Double R," her heart began to race as understanding dawned. "Preston, I know it's too soon," he said quietly. "I know your heart still belongs to Thomas, and I would never presume—" "No," Beatrice interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "It's not that. Thomas will always have a place in my heart, but he would be the first to tell me life is for the living." Hope flickered in Preston's eyes. "What is it, then?" Beatrice gestured helplessly around the small cabin. "Look at me, look at this place. I have nothing to offer a man like you, I'm barely surviving as it is." "Is that what you think?" Preston asked, moving closer still. "That I'm measuring what you can offer?" When she didn't answer, he gently took her hands in his. "Beatrice, when that storm tore the roof from your home, I saw a woman who didn't break. You stood in the wreckage of everything you'd built and started rebuilding before the ground was even dry. That kind of strength, that kind of heart that's worth more than any ranch or position." Tears filled Beatrice's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I don't want your pity, Preston. Pity." He shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Lady, the last thing I feel for you is pity. Admiration, respect, affection, yes, but never pity." The sincerity in his voice broke through the last of Beatrice's defenses. She had been alone for so long, fighting every day just to survive, that the idea of sharing her burden of being seen and valued for exactly who she was seemed almost too much to hope for. "I'm not asking for promises," Preston continued. "Just a chance to see where this might lead. I'll keep my distance if that's what you want, but I needed you to know why I'm staying." Beatrice looked up at him, this man who had appeared with hammer and hope when she needed both most desperately. In his steady gaze, she saw not just desire but a deep respect that touched her more profoundly than any passionate declaration might have. "I don't want you to keep your distance," she admitted softly. Preston's smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, warm, and full of promise. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they separated, Beatrice kept her hands on his shoulders, anchoring herself in this unexpected moment of joy. "I don't know what happens now," she confessed. Preston's laugh was low and warm. "That makes two of us, but I'm willing to find out if you are." And in that moment, with rain drumming against her newly repaired roof and the warmth of Preston's hands on hers, Beatrice found herself facing not just survival, but the possibility of a future brighter than she had dared to imagine. As spring gave way to summer, Preston became a constant in Beatrice's life. He continued to work at the Double R, but every free moment was spent at her homestead, helping to restore what the storm had damaged and building what had never existed before. Together they expanded her garden, reinforced the barn, and began planning for a harsh winter that would test even the most established homesteads. The first time Preston stayed the night properly, in her bed, was a warm July evening after they had spent the day harvesting the first vegetables from her garden. The decision wasn't made with words, but with a look that passed between them as night fell, and Preston moved to leave as he always did. "Stay," Beatrice said simply, holding out her hand. That night she discovered that Preston's gentleness extended to every aspect of his nature. He loved her with the same careful attention he gave to everything thoroughly, patiently, with a focus that left her breathless. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in her narrow bed, Beatrice traced the scars that mapped his body, each one telling a story of his life before her. "This one?" she asked, fingers brushing a jagged line along his ribs. "Cattle rustlers," Preston replied, his voice rumbling beneath her ear where it rested on his chest. 3 years ago, near the Montana border, they didn't take kindly to me interrupting their work. And this," she touched a round, puckered mark on his shoulder. "Arrow. Sioux brave protecting his hunting grounds. Can't say I blame him." Preston's hand covered hers. "Got a good look at dying that day." Beatrice propped herself up to study his face in the moonlight filtering through her window. "I'm glad you didn't." His smile was soft in the darkness. "So am I, particularly at this moment." They fell into a comfortable rhythm as summer progressed. Preston would work his shifts at the Double R, then ride to Beatrice's homestead, often arriving after dark, bone-weary but smiling. Beatrice continued the endless work of maintaining her land, But now, with the knowledge that she wasn't alone in the struggle, word of their arrangement inevitably reached Willow Creek. When Beatrice made her monthly trip to town for supplies in August, she felt the stares and heard the whispers. The widow King, taking up with a ranch hand before her husband was cold in his grave. She held her head high, remembering Preston's words about what truly made a lady, but the judgment stung nonetheless. It was Martha Simmons, the shopkeeper's wife, who finally spoke directly to her as Beatrice was selecting fabric for new curtains. "It's not right what you're doing," Martha said, her voice pitched low but sharp with disapproval. "If Thomas could see you now." Beatrice turned to face the older woman, summoning every ounce of the dignity that had seen her through the darkest days of her life. "Thomas would be grateful I found someone who ensures I don't freeze or starve this winter," she replied evenly. "And with all due respect, Mrs. Simmons, my heart is my own to give." Martha's pinched expression suggested she had more to say, but something in Beatrice's steady gaze gave her pause. With a disapproving sniff, she moved away, leaving Beatrice to complete her shopping in relative peace. When she related the encounter to Preston that evening, he listened with a darkening expression. "Town folks got nothing better to do than mind others' business," he muttered, helping her unload her purchases. "It'll die down eventually. Does it bother you?" Beatrice asked, studying his face. "The talk." Preston set down a bag of flour and turned to her, his expression serious. "Only if it bothers you. I've never much cared what others think of me, but I won't have them hurting you." Beatrice moved to stand before him, placing her hands on his chest. "They can only hurt me if I let them. And I won't." The pride in Preston's eyes as he looked down at her made any discomfort from the town gossip fade to insignificance. He bent to kiss her, and Beatrice marveled at how completely this man had become the center of her world in just a few short months. As August yielded to September, they began discussing more permanent arrangements. Preston had saved nearly every penny of his wages for 5 years, with dreams of his own ranch someday. Now those dreams had expanded to include Beatrice and her homestead. "We could combine our resources," Preston suggested one evening as they sat on her porch, watching a glorious sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Buy more cattle come spring, maybe hire a hand or two. Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Miller?" Beatrice asked, a teasing lilt to her voice. Preston's smile was slow and warm. "Among other arrangements, Mrs. King." The implication was clear, but neither was quite ready to speak it aloud. Instead, they continued planning their future in practical terms: how many head of cattle they could reasonably manage, what improvements the homestead needed before winter set in, whether to expand the cabin or build new. Their comfortable planning was interrupted in late September when riders from the Double R arrived at Beatrice's homestead with urgent news. A cattle drive headed north had lost several men to sickness, and the trail boss was offering double wages to experienced hands who could join immediately. For Preston, it represented a chance to earn in 1 month what would normally take 3 months that could make all the difference to their plans for expansion in the spring. "It's the opportunity we've been waiting for," Preston explained as they discussed the offer that night. "With that money, we could buy twice the cattle we planned." Beatrice nodded, understanding the logic even as her heart resisted the thought of Preston leaving for weeks. "When would you need to go?" "Tomorrow," Preston admitted. "They're already behind schedule and winter comes early in the Northern Territories." "Then you must go," Beatrice said decisively. "We can't pass up such an opportunity." Preston studied her face in the lamplight. "You'll be all right here alone. Winter's coming on fast." "I survived last winter without you," Beatrice reminded him, though the thought of returning to that solitary existence, even temporarily, filled her with dread. "I've laid in more supplies this year thanks to your help. I'll manage." That night they loved each other with a new urgency, both aware of the separation looming before them. As dawn broke, Preston dressed slowly, reluctance evident in every movement. "I'll be back before the first real snow," he promised, pulling on his boots. 6 weeks at most. Beatrice nodded, fighting to maintain her composure. She had known from the beginning that loving a man like Preston would mean accepting the rhythms of ranch life, including the times when duty called him away. "I'll be here," she said simply, helping him gather his few possessions. At the door, Preston turned to her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object and pressed it into her hand, a simple gold band, well worn but polished to a soft glow. "It was my mother's," he explained as Beatrice stared at the ring in her palm. "I've carried it since she died, waiting for." He cleared his throat. "I had planned something more romantic, but with this sudden departure, Preston," Beatrice interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you asking me to marry you?" he nodded, suddenly looking younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "I know it's soon, and if you need more time," Beatrice silenced him with a kiss, pouring into it all the certainty she felt. When they parted, she pressed the ring back into his hand and extended her left finger. "Ask me properly," she whispered. Preston's smile could have lit the darkest night as he dropped to one knee before her. "Beatrice King, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I will." They parted with that promise between them, sustaining Beatrice through the lonely days that followed. She threw herself into preparations for winter, preserving the last of her garden's bounty, chopping and stacking firewood, and mending every item of clothing she owned. Each night she wrote to Preston by lamplight, describing her day and her dreams for their future, though she had no way to send the letters until his return. October brought the first frost, followed quickly by a light snowfall that melted by noon but served as a warning of what was to come. Beatrice watched the western horizon anxiously each day, hoping for sight of a familiar rider, but the weeks stretched on with no word. 6 weeks became 7, and still Preston did not return. Beatrice maintained her faith, knowing that cattle drives were unpredictable and delays common, but as November arrived with its bitter winds and heavy skies, worry began to gnaw at her resolve. It was during the first substantial snowfall of the season that Beatrice heard hoofbeats approaching. She rushed to the door, heart pounding with relief and joy, only to find not Preston but a young rider from the Double R, his face grim beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Mrs. King?" he asked, dismounting stiffly. "Yes," Beatrice replied, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. "What is it?" The young man, barely more than a boy, really twisted his hat in his hands. "I've come from Mr. Rafferty at the Double R. There's been word from the trail boss of the drive Mr. Miller joined." Beatrice gripped the doorframe, steeling herself. "Tell me." "There was trouble, madam. A river crossing gone bad. Several men were swept downstream." The boy's eyes fell to the ground. Mr. Miller was among them. The world seemed to tilt beneath Beatrice's feet. They didn't find him, madam," the boy said quickly. "Some of the others were recovered, but Mr. Miller and one other hand are still missing. The trail boss sent word they searched for 3 days, but with the weather turning." Hope flared in Beatrice's heart, fragile but determined. Then he could still be alive. The messenger's expression was a mixture of pity and discomfort. "The trail boss said the water was freezing, madam, and the current powerful strong, and it's been nearly 2 weeks since it happened." 2 weeks. The knowledge hit Beatrice like a physical blow. Preston had been missing for 2 weeks, and she was only learning of it now. "Thank you for bringing this news," she managed to say, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Please tell Mr. Rafferty I'm grateful for his consideration." The boy nodded, clearly relieved to have delivered his message. He remounted and was gone within moments, leaving Beatrice standing in her doorway as snow swirled around her, the cold seeping into her bones in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. For 3 days, Beatrice moved through her tasks like a sleepwalker, unable to accept what she had been told, yet unable to deny the growing likelihood that Preston was gone. On the 4th morning, she woke with a fierce determination that surprised even herself. Preston had not given up on her when the storm destroyed her home. She would not give up on him now. Dressing in her warmest clothing, Beatrice saddled Penny and rode to the Double R, a journey of nearly 3 hours through snow-covered terrain. When she arrived, the ranch owner himself, Robert Rafferty, came out to meet her, concern evident in his weathered face. "Mrs. King," he greeted her, helping her dismount. "You shouldn't have made this ride in such weather." "I need to know everything about what happened," Beatrice said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Exactly where the crossing was, who was with him, everything." Rafferty sighed, leading her into the warmth of the main house. "Come in first, you're half frozen." Over hot coffee, Rafferty shared what little information he had. The cattle drive had reached the Snake River, swollen with early mountain snow melt. During the crossing, several steers had panicked, causing confusion that led to multiple riders being unseated. Preston and another hand named Davis had been swept downstream. Davis's body had been recovered 5 miles downriver. Preston had simply vanished. "Miller was one of my best men," Rafferty said, genuine regret in his voice. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. King. I know you two were close." "We were engaged to be married," Beatrice said, touching the ring she now wore on a chain around her neck. "And I cannot believe he is gone without proof." Rafferty's expression softened with sympathy. "What are you planning, Mrs. King?" "I want to go to the crossing," Beatrice stated firmly. "See for myself." "It's nearly 300 miles north of here," Rafferty protested, "through mountain terrain in winter. Even if you could make the journey, what do you expect to find that a dozen experienced cowboys couldn't?" Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I don't know, but I have to try." Rafferty studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You remind me of my late wife, stubborn as they come when her mind was set." He sighed heavily. "I can't in good conscience help you undertake such a dangerous journey, Mrs. King. But I can send 2 of my men to make another search of the area now that some time has passed. Would that satisfy you?" It wasn't what Beatrice wanted, but she recognized the reasonableness of his offer. "When would they leave?" "Tomorrow, weather permitting," Rafferty promised. "My best trackers. If there's any sign of Preston, they'll find it." Beatrice reluctantly agreed, knowing she had no real alternative. She spent the night at the Double R in the bunkhouse Preston had called home for 5 years, surrounded by men who shared stories of their missing friend long into the night. Their obvious respect and affection for Preston both comforted and pained her. The next morning, she watched as Rafferty's men departed, then began her own journey back to her homestead, a heaviness in her heart that matched the leaden sky above. Halfway home, the snow began again, thick flakes that quickly obscured the trail. Beatrice pressed on, trusting Penny to find their way, but the growing storm made progress increasingly difficult. By late afternoon, visibility had diminished to almost nothing, and Beatrice realized with growing alarm that she had lost the trail completely. Dismounting to give Penny a rest, she scanned the featureless white landscape for any landmark that might orient her, but everything was hidden beneath the swirling snow. "We need to find shelter," she told the horse, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. For what seemed like hours, Beatrice trudged forward, leading Penny through deepening snow, her feet numb and her face burning with cold despite the scarf wrapped around it. Just as despair began to overtake her determination, she glimpsed a dark shape through the whiteness, a structure of some kind. Summoning her remaining strength, Beatrice moved toward it, finding to her immense relief a small line shack, the kind ranches maintained for cowboys working distant sections of their property. It was crude but solid, and most importantly, it would provide shelter from the killing cold. With fingers stiff from cold, Beatrice managed to open the door and lead Penny inside. The interior was a single room with a small stove, a rough bunk, and little else, but it represented salvation. After securing Penny, Beatrice fumbled to light the stove with supplies left by previous occupants. As warmth slowly began to fill the small space, she sank onto the bunk, exhaustion overtaking her. When Beatrice woke, disoriented, the storm still raged outside, but the shack was warmer than it should have been from the small fire she had managed to start. With a start, she realized someone else was in the shack with her. A figure sat by the stove, feeding it with wood from a pile that hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep. For one wild moment, Beatrice thought it was Preston, but as her vision cleared, she saw it was an older man with a grizzled beard and weathered face. "You're awake," he observed, his voice rough but not unkind. Was beginning to wonder. Beatrice sat up slowly, wary but too weak to feel truly afraid. "Who are you?" "Name's Harlan," the man replied. "This is my shack, more or less. Been riding for the Circle T 20 years now." "I'm sorry for intruding," Beatrice said, gathering her composure. "The storm," Harlan waved a dismissive hand. "No apologies needed, you'd have frozen solid out there. Got your horse settled in the lean-to out back." Gratitude flooded through Beatrice. "Thank you. I'm Beatrice King from a homestead near Cottonwood Creek." "That's a fair piece from here," Harlan remarked. "What brings a woman out alone in such weather?" Briefly, Beatrice explained her situation, her visit to the Double R, and the storm that had caught her on her return journey. She didn't mention Preston, finding the topic too painful to discuss with a stranger. Harlan nodded thoughtfully. "Storm's likely to last another day at least. You're welcome to wait it out here." True to Harlan's prediction, the blizzard continued through the night and into the following day. Beatrice discovered that her rescuer, though rough in appearance and manner, was a surprisingly thoughtful host, sharing his provisions and maintaining a respectful distance that put her at ease. On the second evening, as they shared a simple meal of beans and jerky, Harlan unexpectedly broached the topic she had been avoiding. "Couldn't help but notice that ring you're wearing round your neck," he said casually. "Not many unmarried ladies wear such a thing." Beatrice's hand went to the chain automatically. "I'm engaged, or I was. My fiancé is." She faltered, unable to say the word dead. "Missing," she finished finally. Harlan's eyes, sharp despite his age, studied her face. "That why you were at the Double R? He worked there." Beatrice nodded, finding it strangely easy to confide in this weathered stranger. "Preston Miller. He joined a cattle drive north about 2 months ago. There was an accident at a river crossing." Harlan sat up straighter, his expression changing. "Preston Miller, you say?" "Tall fellow, dark hair, scar along his jaw." Beatrice's heart lurched. "You know him." "Might have met him," Harlan said carefully. "When was this accident?" "About 3 weeks ago at the Snake River crossing," Beatrice replied, hope kindling despite her efforts to restrain it. "Have you heard something?" Harlan scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Maybe. Circle T crew came across a man about 10 days back, half dead on the riverbank about 20 miles downstream from the main crossing. No identification, barely conscious. They took him to a trapper's cabin nearby, only place close enough, given his condition." Beatrice gripped the edge of the rough table, her knuckles white. "Was it Preston? Is he alive?" "Can't say for certain it was your man," Harlan cautioned, "but the description matches and the timing fits. As for whether he survived," he shrugged. "The trapper, Mackenzie, is a gruff old coot but knows his way around treating injuries. If your Preston had any fight left in him, he'd have a chance." It was more hope than Beatrice had dared to entertain since receiving the news of Preston's disappearance. "I need to go there," she said, determination hardening her voice, "as soon as the storm breaks." Harlan regarded her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "It's rough country between here and there, especially for a woman alone." "I won't be dissuaded," Beatrice stated firmly. "I've come this far, I won't turn back now." A slow smile spread across Harlan's weathered face. "Didn't figure you would, that's why I'm offering to take you there myself." Beatrice stared at him in surprise. "You would do that? Why?" Harlan's gaze dropped to the fire. "Had a wife once, long ago, lost her to fever before we'd been married a year. Always wondered if I'd have done more if there'd been any chance." He looked up, meeting Beatrice's eyes. "Point is, some journeys shouldn't be made alone." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes, the first she had allowed herself since receiving the news of Preston's accident. "Thank you," she whispered. The storm finally broke the following morning, leaving a pristine white landscape under a sky of brilliant blue. Harlan estimated it would take them 3 days to reach Mackenzie's cabin, assuming the snow didn't delay them further. They set out at first light, Harlan leading the way on his sturdy roan gelding. Beatrice followed on Penny, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks despite the grueling journey ahead. She had purpose now, and direction, and most importantly, hope. The journey proved every bit as challenging as Harlan had warned. They traversed narrow mountain passes where a single misstep could send horse and rider plummeting hundreds of feet, crossed frozen streams that cracked ominously beneath their weight, and spent nights huddled beside small fires that seemed pitiful against the vast, cold wilderness surrounding them. But Beatrice found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, drawing on the memory of Preston's steadfast support during her own darkest days. If he had not given up on her then, she would not give up on him now. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as the early winter sun was already sinking toward the western mountains, Harlan pointed to a thin spiral of smoke rising from a cluster of pine trees in the valley below them. "Mackenzie's place," he announced. "We made better time than I expected." Beatrice urged Penny forward, impatience overtaking caution, but Harlan moved his horse to block her path. "Best let me go first," he advised. "Mackenzie's not fond of surprises, and he's been known to greet unexpected visitors with a shotgun." Reluctantly, Beatrice reined in her eagerness and followed Harlan's lead down the steep trail to the valley floor. As they approached, she could make out a sturdy log cabin nestled among the trees, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A lean-to stable stood nearby, and various animal pelts were stretched on frames outside the main structure. Harlan halted a respectful distance away and called out, "Mackenzie, it's Harlan from the Circle T, I'm coming in friendly." For a long moment there was no response, then the cabin door creaked open. A tall, gaunt man with a shock of white hair appeared, a rifle held casually but obviously ready in his gnarled hands. "Harlan," he acknowledged gruffly, "bit far from your usual range." "Looking for a man," Harlan replied, dismounting slowly. "Heard your boys from the Circle T might have brought one here, river accident victim about 3 weeks back." Mackenzie's sharp eyes shifted to Beatrice, who had remained mounted behind Harlan. "And who's the woman?" "Name's Beatrice King," Harlan explained. "The man's intended." Something flickered across Mackenzie's weathered face, pity perhaps, or compassion quickly masked. "You'd better come in," he said finally, lowering his rifle. Beatrice dismounted on legs that suddenly felt too weak to support her, dread and hope warring within her chest. Harlan took her elbow, steadying her as they approached the cabin. "He alive?" Harlan asked bluntly as they reached the door. Mackenzie's gaze met Beatrice's directly. "Was this morning?" "Beyond that, I make no promises." The interior of the cabin was dimly lit but surprisingly warm and clean. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. Beatrice's eyes were immediately drawn to a narrow bed in the corner, where a still figure lay beneath several fur blankets. She moved toward it without conscious thought, Harlan's supporting hand falling away as she crossed the room. As she approached, she could see that the man in the bed was indeed Preston, his face gaunt and pale, his normally vibrant presence diminished by illness and injury, but undeniably him. "Preston," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside the bed. He didn't stir, his breathing shallow but regular. A bandage wrapped around his head, and his right arm was splinted and bound to his chest. Beatrice gently touched his face, finding his skin hot with fever. "He's been like this for days," Mackenzie said from behind her. "Fever comes and goes." Took a bad blow to the head in the river, broke his arm and some ribs. Found him half submerged on a sandbar, nearly frozen through. "But he's fighting," Beatrice said, not really a question. "Hardest I've ever seen," Mackenzie confirmed. "Called for someone named B in his fever dreams." "Guessing that's you?" Beatrice nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She took Preston's uninjured hand in hers, his fingers limp and hot against her cool skin. "I'm here, Preston," she murmured, leaning close to his ear. "I found you. Now you need to find your way back to me." For 3 days and nights, Beatrice barely left Preston's side, bathing his fevered brow with cool cloths, spooning broth between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and speaking to him, constantly reminding him of their plans, their hopes, the life waiting for them back at her homestead. Mackenzie proved to be a skilled healer despite his gruff exterior, treating Preston's wounds with poultices of herbs and bark that gradually reduced the angry red inflammation. Harlan remained as well, helping with practical matters and providing quiet support that Beatrice came to depend on. On the 4th night, as Beatrice dozed in a chair beside Preston's bed, her hand still clasping his, she was awakened by a slight pressure against her fingers. Opening her eyes, she found Preston looking back at her, his gaze foggy but focused. "Am I dreaming?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. Beatrice's heart soared. "No," she assured him, tears streaming unchecked down her face. "I'm really here." Confusion clouded his features. "How? That's a story for when you're stronger," Beatrice said, gently stroking his face. "For now, just know I came looking for you. I couldn't believe you were gone." A ghost of Preston's familiar smile touched his pale lips. "Stubborn woman." "You taught me to be," Beatrice replied, bending to kiss his forehead. Preston's recovery was slow but steady after that night. His fever broke the following day, and though he remained weak, his lucid periods grew longer and more frequent. Beatrice learned the full story of the river crossing disaster from his halting account, how he had been swept nearly a mile downstream, before managing to grab onto a partially submerged tree, how he had dragged himself onto a sandbar before losing consciousness, and how he had awakened days later in Mackenzie's cabin with no memory of his rescue. "I kept thinking of you," Preston confessed one evening as he sat propped up in bed, strong enough now to feed himself the stew Mackenzie had prepared. "Every time I wanted to give up, I'd see your face, hear your voice." Beatrice, seated beside him on the edge of the bed, took his hand in hers. "I felt the same way when the storm took my roof. You gave me hope then. I had to try to return the favor." 10 days after Beatrice's arrival at the cabin, Mackenzie declared Preston strong enough to travel, though the journey would need to be taken in easy stages. "Winter's setting in hard," the trapper warned as they prepared to depart. "Best get down to lower elevations while you still can." With Harlan as their guide, they set out for the Circle T Ranch, the closest established settlement. Preston rode double with Beatrice, his injured arm still bound to his chest but his strength returning with each passing day. The journey took nearly a week, with frequent stops to allow Preston to rest. By the time they reached the Circle T, early December had brought shorter days and colder nights, making Beatrice grateful for the ranch's warm hospitality. "Stay through Christmas," urged the ranch owner's wife after hearing their story. "The passes will be clearer by January, and your man needs more time to heal before facing another long journey." Though anxious to return to her homestead, Beatrice recognized the wisdom of the suggestion. She sent word to the Double R of Preston's survival and their whereabouts, along with a request to have someone check on her property periodically until their return. Christmas at the Circle T proved to be a joyous occasion, with ranch hands and their families gathering for a celebration that filled the main house with laughter and music. Preston, though still moving carefully to protect his healing ribs, was well enough to join the festivities, his hand rarely leaving Beatrice's throughout the evening. As midnight approached, he drew her away from the crowded main room and out onto the porch, where stars glittered like ice crystals in the clear night sky. "I've been meaning to do something properly," Preston said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Since our last attempt was rather hurried." Before Beatrice could respond, he carefully lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly as his still tender ribs protested the movement. "Preston, your injuries," Beatrice began, reaching to help him up. "Let me do this right," Preston insisted, taking her left hand in his. From his pocket, he withdrew the gold band she had returned to him for safekeeping during her vigil at his bedside. "Beatrice King," he said, his deep voice steady and clear in the still night air. "These past months have shown me what true strength and love look like. You rebuilt after the storm took your roof, and you crossed half the territory to find me when everyone else had given up. I can think of no greater honor than to spend my life by your side, building something that will withstand whatever storms may come." Tears froze on Beatrice's cheeks as she smiled down at him. "Are you asking me something, Mr. Miller?" Preston's answering smile was warm enough to melt the snow around them. "Will you marry me, Beatrice? Not someday, not when we've built something grand, but now just as we are." "Yes," Beatrice answered without hesitation. "Now, tomorrow, forever, yes." They were married on New Year's Day, 1876, in the Circle T. Tikes main house, with Harlan standing as Preston's best man and the ranch owner's wife attending Beatrice. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher who had ridden in from the nearest town pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled ranch hands and their families seemed to shake the very rafters. "Mrs. Miller," Preston murmured against Beatrice's ear as they danced their first dance as husband and wife, his movements still careful but determined. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Beatrice replied, her heart so full she wondered how her chest contained it. They remained at the Circle T until mid-February, when the worst of winter had passed and Preston's injuries had healed enough for comfortable travel. The ranch owner presented them with a wedding gift, a young bull and 2 heifers, the beginnings of the cattle herd they had planned to establish in the spring. The journey back to Beatrice's homestead, their homestead, now took nearly 2 weeks, but they arrived to find the property in good condition, thanks to the double R hands who had checked on it throughout the winter. The roof Preston had repaired the previous spring had held firm against the winter storms, a testament to his craftsmanship. As they stood together in the doorway of the cabin, surveying what would be their kingdom, Preston wrapped his arm around Beatrice's waist and pulled her close. "It's not much," he acknowledged, looking at the modest cabin and the land stretching beyond it. "But it's ours." Beatrice leaned into his embrace, remembering how desolate she had felt standing in the same spot less than a year earlier, surrounded by the wreckage of her home and her hopes. "It's everything," she corrected him softly. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new growth and possibilities. Preston and Beatrice worked side by side to expand the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. They fenced new pastureland for their small but growing herd, and planted an expanded garden that promised to keep their root cellar full for the coming winter. Word of their story spread throughout the territory, bringing unexpected visitors, some merely curious, others genuinely moved by the tale of the widow whose home was destroyed and the cowboy who arrived with hammer and hope. Beatrice found herself hosting impromptu gatherings, the same townspeople who had once whispered behind her back, now eager to be counted among her friends. "Funny how folks change their tune," Preston remarked after one such visit, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the sunset paint the western sky. Beatrice smiled, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach where their first child was just beginning to make its presence known. "People love a happy ending." "Is that what this is?" Preston asked, his blue eyes warm with love as he covered her hand with his own. "Not an ending," Beatrice corrected, leaning to kiss him softly. "Just the beginning of a very long story." And as the years passed, their story did indeed continue to unfold in ways neither could have imagined on that stormy April day when fate first brought them together. Their homestead grew into a prosperous ranch. Their family expanded to include 3 children who inherited their parents' determination and spirit, and their love deepened with each challenge overcome and each joy shared. Every April, on the anniversary of the storm that had torn the roof from Beatrice's home, They would gather their children and later their grandchildren to tell the tale not of destruction, but of how sometimes losing what protects you can open your life to unexpected blessings. How a storm can clear away what was to make room for what could be. And how, sometimes, salvation arrives not in grand gestures but in the simple offering of a hammer, a helping hand, and the hope of better days to come.